So welcome everyone. Very nice to have you at this special Friday webinar today. And it's my name is Christian Sasser. I'm the astronomer in charge for iTelescope, and I'm so delighted to see all of you, especially as the weekend nears and we can have lots of fun with the stars, I hope. So this time it's going to be interesting. We're diving into the Utah Desert, and I'm really happy to have Craig Stocks here. So if I think about the Utah Desert, I've been to Arches National Park. It's absolutely beautiful. Zion National Park. And then, of course, the Canyon Reef National Park. There are so many beautiful Cedar and so on and so on. The list just goes on and on. It's such a beautiful area. So I'm really delighted to introduce to you Craig Stocks, who's put a lot of energy. He's also an amazing astrophotographer. So Craig, let's welcome you, and then let's get going. Just wait a minute, he'll be here in a moment. I hear his microphone's on. He's just putting his video camera on. Hopefully he'll be here.
Yep, I am here.
Very nice, Craig. Wonderful to have you, and welcome to iTelescope, to our Friday webinar. So the floor is all yours. Done the introduction, off you go. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. Let me share my screen. So if all is working well, I should look like a dumbbell now.
You do.
Okay.
Perfect.
So with that, let's dive right in. I'm going to talk about my journey to creating a robotic remote astrophotography operation. And of course, robotic means that the machines are going to do the work for you. Remote obviously means the work is being done somewhere else. And I approach astrophotography more as a art than a science. So you may see that in some of my images. But I mean, wouldn't we all love to have a robot to do our work for us? I mean, you could go to bed early, stay in bed later, be with your family, go to astronomy club meetings and webinars without needing to attend the telescope. So that became my goal. First, kind of a brief history of me. I actually started my adult life, if that kind of implies a level of maturity, but started my adult life in the 70s as a professional photographer at a small daily newspaper and also at a portrait studio. At some point, I realized that's not a good get-rich-quick scheme, so I switched to engineering, worked at Caterpillar for 30 years and retired, it seems like quite a while ago now, in 2008. So for the last 14 years or so, I have been pretending to be a fine art photographer, and I do have work in some of the local galleries. And I also enjoy teaching and sharing and helping other people along the way, occasionally doing small classes and one-on-one training. But at some point, I guess I pointed my camera at the night sky and realized that I had taken a picture of a nebula. And, you know, that's how we get sucked into the rabbit hole. So this is kind of my journey down the rabbit hole into robotic remote astrophotography. It was somewhat easy because astro equipment is really a lot like a regular camera. They have a telescope for a lens. You have live view for a viewfinder. You use filters in front of the camera. Most of the cameras that we use have Sony sensors. You have a tripod. So in fact, most people will start with a DSLR or a mirrorless and a telephoto lens. And that's really a great way to start. It's also a lot like regular photography in the way you approach it. You select a subject, you point the camera at it, frame the subject, focus. You might pan to follow a moving subject, take one or more frames, and then post-process the image to reveal your vision. So all feels very familiar to me. But there are lots of different types of astrophotography that I have kind of dabbled in briefly, probably in all of them. Astro landscape and Milky Way is kind of the gateway drug that got me started. Solar system with the moon and the planets. And of course, some people really enjoy solar imaging, taking pictures of the sun. And as you get further out, you have galaxies that are way out there, star clusters, and closer to home in our Milky Way are the nebulae. But I think for me, taking pictures that included the night sky really got me enthused and started on the journey. And from that, I kind of transitioned into the more traditional astro landscapes, This is not a mountain. This is more of a hill at the Badlands National Park, and it's illuminated with a flashlight. So people often ask, well, how did you light up that mountain? It's not a mountain. Death Valley, more focus on the Milky Way, and frequently using the Milky Way just as a background for a more interesting foreground, again, with some light painting. That led to photographing the moon and some of the special events. For instance, a couple of years ago, the moon occulted Mars, it passed in front of Mars. So the yellow spot that you see on the right, just coming out from behind the moon, is Mars. Earlier this year, we had a lunar eclipse, so that was kind of fun. And I don't really do much planetary, but this is just a size comparison when Saturn was right next to the moon a few years ago. I have dabbled in, currently dabbling in solar. It's not a big thing for me yet, but it's very intriguing. We'll see where that leads me. A lot of people really love galaxies. And of course, there are hundreds of billions of galaxies out there, and a lot of them are close enough that you can get some pretty decent pictures. This is the Whirlpool Galaxy, the Sombrero Galaxy, M81 and M82. And when I heard that they were surrounded by a lot of the integrated flux nebula, a big cloud of dust that's just illuminated by the combined light of the Milky Way, I decided I needed to get a picture of those and try to include as much of the IFN as I could capture. And of course, everyone's favorite is Andromeda. And that's probably one that we tend to start with because it's big and easy to find and easy to photograph. I don't think anybody really photographs star clusters. If you've seen one, you've probably seen them all. So I would never photograph a star cluster other than the ones that I have photographed. This is M13, the Hercules cluster. Some of them come with a special treat, like M4 is kind of nice because it actually is sitting beyond some real nice nebula in the direction of Antares and the Rho-Ophiuchi region up here on the right. So here's M4 tucked in with some really nice colorful nebula around it. But what I really find is I love nebula, especially when you can get a deeper exposure and capture things that you just can't really see by eye. I guess you'd say there's two kinds of nebula. There's really more than that, but fundamentally there's the reflection type that you photograph with natural red, green, and blue in natural colors. And there are the emission type nebulae that are actually glowing from ionized gases in distinctive colors, such as red for hydrogen and a kind of a cyan blue color for oxygen. And one of the nice things about nebulae is, first of all, they're large, or a lot of them are large, so you don't need a really big telescope to go after some of the real popular items. This illustration, everything here is the same scale. So you can see the moon here, M81 and M82 for a size comparison. Andromeda, not a very good image of it, is much larger than the moon. Rosette, even the Orion Nebula is bigger than the full moon, and some, like the California Nebula or the Christmas Tree Cluster and the Foxfire Nebula, are a lot larger than a full moon. You also have a lot more opportunity for artistic interpretation with nebula. I think people expect galaxies to look like the galaxy. With nebula, there's a lot of different ways to color map to bring out the different gases and things that are going on. And I really enjoy that freedom of expression that you get with a nebula. Sometimes I kind of let my imagination go wild a little bit. This is just showing the elephant trunk mapped 3 different ways. The Spaghetti Nebula, commonly seen in an HOO color mapping, which is hydrogen, oxygen, oxygen in red, green, and blue. Or you can turn that around and map it as oxygen, oxygen, hydrogen, and get a different look at the same thing. Jellyfish Nebula here, mapped in a somewhat uncommon OHS, or oxygen, hydrogen, sulfur. So there's a little bit of oxygen showing up as red, but a lot of hydrogen and a lot of sulfur. And, and I have felt free to go ahead and include green in my images. I know a lot of astro imagers shy away from green because it's not a very natural color. I have frequently embraced it in my images. Bubble nebula here in an HSO version. Black and white works really well too. It really lets some of the details shine without being distracted by color. And sometimes the stars get in the way too. So here we have not only black and white, but a starless rendering showing the Horsehead Nebula, the Flame Nebula, and then this wonderful nebulosity in the background that people say you can see a lion's head here in the background. This is a wide panoramic. This is that same lion's head here, the Horsehead Nebula, and then the Orion Nebula. Lots of hydrogen gas floating around out there in this 5-panel mosaic. But you can zoom in and get a closer view, and you can zoom in and get even closer views. And in this case, I put 3 of them together in a triptych with the Flame, Horsehead, and the Running Man Nebula, which is adjacent to the Orion Nebula. Sol Nebula in a Hubble palette, SHO Hubble palette. Flying Bat and Giant Squid. The squid is fairly bright in hydrogen. I'm sorry, the bat is fairly bright in hydrogen. The squid is fairly dim in oxygen, so it takes a lot more data to get the blue squid than it does to get the bat in the background. But it was one of those that after capturing a little bit of data and seeing the squid start to emerge, I went back and got a lot more data to try to fill it in. It sucks you right in. And the Eastern Veil in HOO. This is a wider view of the Cygnus loop, so that Eastern Veil is over here on the right-hand side. And this image I was pleased was selected by NASA as the APOD for June 22nd. Dark nebula are really fun. This is commonly referred to, I think, as the Dark Horse Nebula. And once you start seeing that horse shape in the center of the Milky Way, you can't not see it. It's a great way to kind of get your bearings when you're looking at the center of the Milky Way. The Blue Horsehead Nebula, another huge cloud of dust that's floating around out there in the Milky Way, not too far away from us, about 400 light years. This little circle shows the apparent size of the moon compared to this 3-panel mosaic of the Blue Horsehead. A little bit wider view of the M81 and M82 and all of the integrated flux nebula floating around in between us and the galaxies. Iris Nebula. M78, a very bright reflection nebula, and then Bernard's Loop, which kind of surrounds Orion, glowing in the red hydrogen alpha. And a kind of a Hubble starless view of the tadpoles and flaming star. Interestingly, even though they look adjacent, I think one of them is about 10 times further away than the other. And of course, one of our favorites, the Helix Nebula, in a combination of RGB and HA. And sometimes things like this can inspire you to silliness, which led to the discovery of the Photoshop Nebula. So I started down the rabbit hole with a star tracker, because if you don't track with the stars, you wind up getting star trails rather than pinpoint stars. And my entry point was a Skywatcher Star Adventurer. It added the ability to track the motion of the sky. It enabled longer exposures, but really everything is manual, from how you set it up, how you find your target. It's extremely manual, a long way from robotic and remote. But it does get you started, and it has the added elusive factor of being able to use it with telescope. So you can actually mount a small telescope on it and start to work your way down the entry to the rabbit hole. From that, I decided, well, I probably need a proper telescope and a go-to mount. because the go-to mount can locate targets that I could never find. It gives you better tracking, and telescope optics are really optimized for stars where camera lenses generally are not. But it's still a very hands-on when you stand next to the mount and operate it to do everything. So to get away from the mount, I moved to the ASI Air, which is a wonderful little package. This is that little red box sitting on top of the telescope. It can find and follow the target. It doesn't have a keyboard or a monitor. It uses a phone or a tablet to be the user interface, but you do have to be within about 20 feet or so. But it is far enough that you can stay inside the house or sit in your car while it's doing the work. So start to separate yourself from the telescope a little bit. It also supports auto guiding, which allows you to go to much longer exposures and get deeper into the sky by using a guide scope. And it basically locks onto one or more stars and then issues small corrections to the mount if it sees those stars drift in the field. That also led to upgrading to a dedicated astronomy camera to get cleaner images. I opted for a monochrome camera. And again, the ASI Air can communicate with that camera and look at the images and do plate solving to make sure the telescope is pointed exactly at the target that you have in mind. And that also allows you to put a filter drawer in between the camera and the telescope so that you can put in filters for specific wavelengths such as hydrogen or oxygen, or if you want natural color, red, green, and blue filters. People sometimes ask, what are those filters? Is that something you do in Photoshop? Well, no, they're actually glass filters that look a lot like the filters you would screw onto the front of a camera lens. Although instead of screwing them onto the front of the telescope, which would be quite large, you put them between the camera and the telescope. So they're, 1.25 to 2 inch diameter usually. And they're such a common thing that, you would photograph, for instance, hydrogen in its glowing red color, oxygen in its glowing cyan or blue color. And then when you combine those two, you get a full color image. So because you're using multiple filters and you would have to get up in the middle of the night to go out and swap filters, that leads the lazy man to use a filter wheel. So there's a little carousel in here where you can mount 5 or 7 or 8 different filters, and then the computer will rotate to bring the desired filter between the camera and the telescope. As long as we're being lazy, we can also add an electronic automatic focuser that actually turns the focus knob on the telescope for you. So now we're getting pretty automated. We can find and follow the targets of our choice. We can change filters. We can focus and refocus during the night. The ASI Air can control the camera exposures. It's really a nice little package. It's one integrated system, but it's really not designed for true remote use. Like I say, you can be in the house. It can even manage things like a meridian flip for you, but it's not intended for remote use. For remote, you really have to upgrade to a complete computer. So I opted for a little Intel NUC type PC, which in this case is mounted on top of the telescope. Both the good and the bad of that is that you can now choose from a wide variety of different programs, what programs you want to use to run your imaging session. But you do have to choose. Where the ASI Air was an integrated package, now you become the integrator. So I wound up using Voyager as my top level control system to control the overall imaging session. You have ASCOM to control communication between the computer and all these different devices, a program like PhD2 to control auto guiding, plugins from Pegasus to control the camera rotator, which is this little blue device you see right here. So it can rotate the camera to the desired angle. And then drivers from ASI for the filter wheel, the focuser, and I was using a ASTAP, which is an online service for plate solving. So you wind up having to configure all of this to make things work. But once you get it working, it's pretty automatic. And so with the Nook controlling everything, if it's connected to the internet, and if I'm connected to the internet somewhere else, I can now use a remote desktop application like Google Remote Desktop to access the Nook and actually operate the Nook remotely. Now I can actually go remote. And it all depends on the internet. Here's just a quick screen grab showing Voyager and all of the different controls that you might be looking at, as well as a preview of the latest image. So now it was time to go remote, but we need a place for the telescope. And again, there's lots of options. You can put it in your own backyard, and a lot of people do that. You can put it at a remote location that you own or that maybe you have access to. Maybe a friend has a farm or someplace out in the country, and they would let you put up an observatory. You can also rent a spot in a remote observatory, which is a popular solution for some people. And of course, you can rent time on a fully configured system. And looking at this kind of gave birth to our idea of starting a Utah Desert Remote Observatories. And what we're doing there is providing pier rental for people who want to rent a pier to locate their remote system in our observatory. Basically, we provide a solid independent concrete foundation for each telescope, power, internet, roof control, weather and sky data. We have on-site caretakers who live on the property, and we can even manufacture a custom pier for you. But in order to do that, first we had to find a property. And we've set some requirements. We wanted a dark sky. We said a Bortle 2 or better based on the light pollution map. We wanted a clear view of the horizon. And if you've ever been in Utah or the Southwest, you know there's a lot of mountains, and they can sometimes get in the way. We needed it to be accessible year-round, which kind of ruled out some of the higher elevations where they closed the road in the winter. We wanted to have sufficient space to separate us from our neighbors so that we didn't have people encroaching on us. Big one is utilities. Water rights in the West is a big deal, and you can easily have land, but no water rights, which means you don't have water. We need power, obviously, although power we could probably get by with solar if we had everything else correct. The big one that was hard to find is high-speed internet. It's really hard to find secluded dark sky locations that have all these things and have high-speed internet. So we spent a lot of time with the dark sky map, looking at realtor listings for rural properties, trying to triangulate between, do they have internet? Is it a dark site? How much land is there? What's the price? How far is it from home, which we're in the St. George area, this little light pollution dome here. Las Vegas is down here, and then, of course, LA in the bottom left. But eventually, we managed to find this kind of unicorn of a property about 60 miles north, and that became the site of our Utah Desert Remote Observatories operation. It did need a little work when we first got it. This dilapidated single wide trailer was see-through in many areas. It looked like it had been vandalized and stripped, and it had been sitting empty for I think a couple decades. So the first thing we needed to do was dispose of that. And fortunately, our son works for a local electrical contractor, and he had the opportunity early on to borrow things like an excavator or a skid steer for the weekend. And that's how we tore down the old structure, and it was hauled away in 3 big roll-off dumpsters. So we got rid of that, brought in some road base, built an RV pad that has power and a sewer hookup or a septic hookup. And then we could put a little camping trailer out there, which serves as our temporary office while we're doing all the rest of the development. We decided early on that it would be a good idea to build a little prototype observatory so that we could test out all of our crazy ideas. And the company that we wanted to use for the main observatory was a Quonset hut design. And they also had little Quonset sheds, they called them, which was a 10 by 12 little Quonset hut. And so we decided to build that with a single pier. but do as much as we could, everything the same as we would in the full-sized observatory, to really prove out our building methods and control systems and make sure everything was going to work. And the building, as you'll see, actually rides on two 24-foot long steel I-beams. So the first thing we need to do was put the pier in the ground, and you can see it here in the picture. This is a 24-inch diameter riser, and it's attached to about 1.5 yards, almost 2 yards of concrete that are buried below grade, that go down to about 3 feet deep in a big block of concrete with rebar and connecting, and then this 24-inch diameter riser that will come up through the floor of the observatory, but not connected to the floor of the observatory. So they're independent. And over here on the right, you can see one of the two I-beam rails. For the prototype, it's just supported on 4x4 posts that are set in concrete, and those go into pockets that are welded to the bottom of the I-beam. So once that's in place, it was time to start putting up the Quonset hut. A little hard to see, but you can see some C channels here sitting on top of the near rail. Actually, there's one on both rails, and you can see there's roller assemblies underneath it that actually allow that to roll back and forth on the I-beam. And there are rollers here that actually capture it onto the I-beam so it can't come off. So the process is you just start with the first one. You assemble 5 sections into a hoop, and then you stand it up and bolt it in place, and then you assemble the next one, stand it up, bolt it in place. And we were using the excavator to carry them over and stand them up. And you just keep doing that. This was kind of an all-day project. And eventually, by the end of the day, we had them all up, and we had the start of an observatory that would roll back and forth on the rails. This little video shows a time lapse of us building the floor inside the observatory. It's attached to the 4x4s and not to the concrete foundation. So once we had the floor in, the next step was putting up some walls. So we have some 4-foot high walls that go around the telescope floor, and that also supports the front of the observatory. So here we are putting in the walls. I said those are 4 foot high. They provide some protection from wind, and more importantly, protection from critters that might come wandering through at night, so that we don't wind up with a deer walking across the telescope floor or something. And if you keep doing this long enough and adding pieces to it, eventually you get the complete building. We added the back wall because the hut itself was just a series of hoops. So we framed in the back wall and put in metal panels for the back. And ta-da, we have an observatory. And this, you can really see here the rails. The little gray box here is a gate opener, and it's attached to a chain that runs from the front of the observatory back to this diagonal brace at the back. And so that just pulls the building back and forth along the rail. Now, this is a view from the front. You see the door, the front wall is stationary, and the rest of the building moves. And just to show how that moves, when you give it the command, the opener starts to pull the chain. And it opens up. And that has been just rock solid reliable. I've never had a malfunction with that since we first put it in. This is a kind of a detail showing the post, the I-beam. We're actually using hoist trolleys upside down to capture the excuse me to capture the building onto the I-beam, and then we have a bracket with the motor attached to pull the chain back and forth. So that's the prototype that we have in operation, and it's been operating since about September of last year. This is a design drawing for the main observatory building, which will be much larger. This rail, instead of 24 feet long, will be 90 feet long. There'll be multiple piers inside the telescope floor. The building itself is same principal, just larger, that will roll off to the east. And rather than just having a flat wall on the front, we're going to attach an office area where we'll have computers, a restroom, some storage for equipment, things like that. This is just another artist view showing an overhead view of the office and the telescope floor. These circles represent the radius around each one of the piers. For the last almost year, most of our time has gone into building infrastructure. The property is 120 acres, and the gravel road, which is a county maintained road, which turned out was, if you don't have access to a county maintained road, you can't build. So fortunately, we had a county maintained road, and this is where our power and fiber optic internet comes from. The RV pad is up here. So all of this kind of existed. What we had to build was a gravel road all the way out to the observatory, and then from the observatory area out to the caretaker's house where our daughter and son-in-law live. And then we also had to run water, power, and fiber optic underground all the way out to these places. So that was a lot of digging, a lot of road base got brought in to build all that up. And what we've been doing more recently is starting to work on the observatories. We had our official groundbreaking, if you want to call it that, April 30th. So about, what, a month and a half ago? 2.5 months ago. So this was our groundbreaking. And of course, we did it at night so we could have some stars in the sky. We've been digging foundations. This is my son in one of the foundation holes. So about a yard and a quarter of concrete goes in each one of these holes for the telescope. And then you can see these sonotubes, or the 24-inch diameter forms that we use to form the risers. And these will wind up sticking up about a foot above the finished floor inside the observatory building. So it's a family project. This is our youngest grandson wetting down one of the foundation pits before the concrete gets poured in. And it was kind of a two-step process. We would pour the foundation one week, put in rebar, set the sonotube, and then the following week have the cement truck come back out and fill those tubes, and it's kind of jump along. We would do 6 at a time. So they would fill some tubes and then fill the next set of foundation holes until we had it all done. This was filling some of the foundations. Here you can see one of the tubes has been filled now, and we're filling some additional ones. And this is what it looks like right now. We have the pier sitting out here, and then we came back and excavated all around it for the concrete foundation wall that's going to support the buildings. So the kind of this excavation you see around the piers is going to be the stem wall that supports the rail system for the building. And then this is where the foundation will go for the office. And hopefully early next week, they'll actually start putting up the forms and pouring concrete for this. So starting to really make progress. Inside, what we have in the remote observatory is a pier with the nook is now attached on the side of the pier. This is an older Paramount MX Plus mount. It's now sitting on an ME2, a little bit larger mount, and then a plane wave CDK 12.5. Inside the system, inside the observatory, we actually have a separate computer just to control the building, the weather system, the all sky camera, the sky quality meter, and the seeing monitor. And all those, incidentally, are available on the weather page of our website. I also have found having a networked power strip is real useful, so that if I need to, for instance, occasionally I'll have to reset the mount, I can do that remotely. Just a view of the weather system. And this takes a little bit of getting used to learn how to read, particularly the temperature in the clouds. The easy way to do it, if you look at the cloud sensor portion of the weather system, you'll see that there's a gray blocky area, and then below that, you'll see a white or blue area. And in the midst of that, you'll see a darker blue line. Basically, the way you interpret that, if the dark blue line is up into the gray, that means it's cloudy. If it's below that gray area, that means the sky is clear. Then once you kind of get your mind accustomed to that, you can just glance at the chart and say, okay, yeah, here, right now on the far right hand of the side, the blue line is below the gray region. That means it's clear at this time. I mentioned I'm using Voyager for overall control, and the SkyX, which is from the same company that produces the Paramount mounts, to actually control the mount and sometimes to do the auto guiding. Voyager is nice because it allows complete control of a sequence or session. In other words, picking a single target or a mosaic of several different frames to form an image. It manages the framing and the rotation angle of the camera. It manages autofocus, and it has a scripting process so that you can create a script to go through multiple different targets during a single night. So a typical imaging sequence might consist of different subs for, in this case, have luminosity, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and then red, green, and blue, which are further down off the screen. And you set the length of the exposure, how many of each you want, as well as some parameters. For instance, on start, what do you want it to do? What do you want it to do for cooling? How do you want it to manage tracking and the guiding? Do you want it to manage the meridian flip and so forth? So you configure all of that, and then you put that into a simple script called drag script, where you can basically grab objects over here, drag them into the script, and then configure what sequence you want to run, when do you want it to start, when do you want it to end, and so forth. But in simple terms, what this script says is control all the equipment, wait till it's almost dark, calibrate the guide system, wait till it's completely dark, then start sequence one. If there's an error, send me an email and go on to sequence two. If there's an error, send an email, go on to sequence three, and so forth. And when it's done for the night, park the telescope, disconnect the equipment, and shut down. So very simply, you can kind of script what you want the system to do that night. So my typical workflow is I kind of watch the weather. I could program all these things to start automatically, but I prefer to make a conscious decision to be the one to open the observatory and actually start the sequence. So I watch the weather. I'll configure the script as I decide what I want to image that night, open the observatory, launch the programs, and go to bed. And my robot at my remote observatory now works for me all night long, imaging the sky. In the morning, I get up and all of the images from the night have been dropped into a Dropbox folder and uploaded to my computer at home. So when I get up in the morning, I have data ready to work on. So I guess my experience with the remote observatory is, first of all, remote takes some getting used to. You know, if you're used to being able to go out in the backyard and touch the telescope or actually go look at it and see, you know, where's it really pointed? You can't do that as easily anymore. So you learn to rely on remote sensors and cameras and so forth. And you can't actually go fix something in the moment. So you have to rely on caretakers or, like I said, the remote control power strip so that you can reset things remotely. But on the plus side, I'm convinced I get more data and certainly better data. The fact that I'm imaging under a dark sky, you know, obviously you get better data than you do from the city, but also I image more nights. I tend to run 65 to the last few months, I've been running about 85% of the nights I've been imaging. And beyond that, I don't have to be physically present. I can be in bed, I could be at a dinner party, I could go to the movies. I don't have to be babysitting the telescope. It's doing the work for me, whether I'm actually engaged in the process that night or not. So for me, it has been a great experience. So just a few more sample images. California nebula. This is the witch head in a mostly starless rendering. The Orion is a triptych. I think we saw that earlier. M78 in a wider panoramic, including the Horsehead and the Flame Nebula. Orion in a wide field RGB plus a lot of hydrogen alpha in the field surrounding it. And Orion in a Hubble palette without stars. So more or less the same data, but just a very different interpretation in the post-processing. And again, I chose to let the green be green. Close-up of the heart of the Heart Nebula. Jellyfish, in this case, without stars. I really like the way it just kind of glows against a black background. Soul Nebula. This is kind of what you see when you look at the sky, or if you just take an image in RGB. But by imaging in narrowband, you can bring out a lot of really interesting stuff. Christmas tree cluster, flame and tadpoles, the moon without anything exciting happening, elephant trunk and Hubble palette. Like we saw M81, M82 earlier. So that's kind of what I put together.